The small television mounted high on the concrete wall of cell B47 at MDC Brooklyn had become Nicolás Maduro's only window to the world he'd once controlled. On this gray January morning, 13 days after his capture, the former Venezuelan president sat on the edge of his narrow metal bunk, his distinctive thick, dark gray mustache twitching slightly as he watched CNN International's breaking news coverage. His cellmate Rodriguez had learned to recognize that particular facial expression, the one that appeared when Maduro was processing information that didn't align with the reality he wanted to believe. The chyron scrolling across the bottom of the screen made Maduro's weathered hands, still bearing the prison ID wristband, grip the edge of his bunk until his knuckles went pale. Venezuela's acting president Delcy Rodriguez holds productive call with President Trump. Delcy, his Delcy, the woman he'd appointed as vice president, the woman who'd stood beside him through 13 years of economic collapse, international sanctions, and relentless American pressure, the woman who'd been in the presidential palace when U.S. forces had broken through the steel doors of his compound at 2 a.m. on January 3rd. The woman who'd watched American soldiers drag him and his wife Celia onto a military transport helicopter. Now she was having productive calls with Donald Trump. The CNN anchor continued with that practiced tone of measured significance that American journalists used when discussing international political shifts. Sources tell CNN that the call between acting President Rodriguez and President Trump lasted approximately 45 minutes and covered topics including the release of political prisoners, economic cooperation, and the future of U.S.-Venezuelan relations. A spokesperson for Rodriguez described the conversation as long, productive, and courteous. Delcy Rodriguez was being courteous to the man who'd ordered the military operation that had destroyed everything they'd built together. "You okay, man?" Rodriguez asked from the lower bunk. The cellmate had been watching Maduro's face carefully, recognizing the signs of someone receiving devastating news. Maduro didn't respond. His dark brown eyes remained fixed on the screen as it cut to footage of the Miraflores Palace in Caracas. His palace, the seat of power he'd occupied for nearly 13 years. The camera showed Delcy Rodriguez standing at a podium bearing the Venezuelan national seal, flanked by her brother Jorge Rodriguez and Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello. She looked different somehow. More confident, less defensive. The posture of someone who no longer had to operate in another person's shadow. "Venezuela is entering a new political moment," Rodriguez said in Spanish, her voice steady and clear. "A moment where coexistence, where living together, where recognition of the other allows building and erecting a new spirituality. We seek peace and peaceful coexistence with all nations, including the United States. Peace with the United States." Maduro's round, full face, marked by deep stress lines from 2 weeks of incarceration, registered the impact of those words like physical blows. How many times had he stood at that same podium and denounced American imperialism? How many speeches had he given about resisting the Yankee Empire? How many times had Delcy stood beside him, nodding in agreement, echoing those same sentiments? The broadcast continued. Acting President Rodriguez also announced that Venezuela has released over 400 prisoners detained during the Maduro administration, calling it part of a new chapters in Venezuelan governance. Human rights organizations have welcomed the releases while noting that many more political prisoners remain detained. 400 prisoners released without consulting him, without asking for his input, as if he no longer existed. His lawyer Barry Pollock had warned him this would happen. During their last meeting 3 days ago, Pollock had been blunt. "You need to understand that the Venezuelan government is moving forward without you. Rodriguez has been sworn in as acting president. She's making decisions. She's the one negotiating with Washington now." But Maduro hadn't believed it would happen this quickly. He'd assumed that Delcy would resist, would maintain the revolutionary stance, would refuse to cooperate with the Americans who'd violated Venezuelan sovereignty. He'd assumed loyalty meant something. The assumption had been catastrophically wrong. The news coverage shifted to analysis from a panel of experts discussing the implications of Rodriguez's apparent pivot toward cooperation with the Trump administration. A former State Department official spoke with barely concealed satisfaction. What we're seeing is a pragmatic calculation by acting President Rodriguez. She understands that Venezuela's economic survival depends on normalizing relations with the United States. The question is whether she can maintain control while making these changes. Pragmatic. That was the word they were using. Not treasonous, not betrayal. Pragmatic. Maduro's prison-issued khaki uniform felt suddenly constricting. The 8x10 cell seemed to shrink around him. He stood abruptly, pacing the 3 steps from bunk to wall and back again, his short gray-black hair catching the harsh fluorescent light. His Venezuelan facial features, the broad nose, the full lips beneath that distinctive mustache, were set in an expression of barely controlled fury. "She sold me out," he said aloud, his voice rough with emotion. 13 years. 13 years we worked together, and she sold me out in 13 days. Rodriguez from the lower bunk spoke carefully, recognizing the volatility of Maduro's emotional state. Maybe she didn't have a choice. Maybe Trump threatened her, or maybe she's trying to save Venezuela from worse consequences. There are always choices. Maduro's voice rose, echoing off the concrete walls. She chose to cooperate with the country that kidnapped her president. She chose to release prisoners without authorization. She chose to stand at my podium and talk about new political moments while I'm sitting in an American prison. The outburst attracted attention from the guard station. A corrections officer appeared at the cell door. "Keep it down, Maduro. You want to spend the afternoon in isolation?" Maduro forced himself to sit back on the bunk, hands clenched into fists on his knees. The guard lingered for a moment, then moved on. The television continued its coverage, now showing footage of Venezuelan citizens celebrating in the streets of Caracas, waving flags and chanting slogans about freedom and change. Some held signs thanking Trump for removing Maduro. Others celebrated the prisoner releases. His people, the people he'd claimed to serve, dancing in the streets because he was gone. The really devastating news came 3 hours later. During the midday news cycle, Maduro had been lying on his bunk, staring at the concrete ceiling and replaying 13 years of memories with Delcy Rodriguez, when the CNN anchor delivered an update that made his entire body go rigid. "We're learning new details about Wednesday's phone call between acting Venezuelan President Delcy Rodriguez and President Trump. According to sources familiar with the conversation, Rodriguez thanked Trump for what she called his decisive action in removing President Maduro, and pledged full cooperation with American efforts to stabilize Venezuela's economy and political system. Thanked him. Delcy had thanked Trump for kidnapping her president. The anchor continued. Additionally, CNN has confirmed that CIA Director John Ratcliffe made a previously undisclosed visit to Caracas on Thursday, where he held a 3-hour meeting with acting President Rodriguez and her senior advisors. While the specific contents of that meeting remain classified, sources indicate that discussions centered on intelligence cooperation, counter-narcotics efforts, and the transition of power in Venezuela. The CIA director, in Caracas, meeting with Delcy for 3 hours, while Maduro sat in a Brooklyn prison cell, completely cut off from the government he'd led for over a decade. Something broke inside Maduro in that moment. Not dramatically, not with rage or violence, but with a quiet, terrible finality. The realization settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He was irrelevant. The government was functioning without him. His vice president was negotiating directly with American intelligence. Decisions were being made, prisoners were being released, policies were being changed, and none of it required his input or approval. He had become a historical footnote, while still alive, to witness his own obsolescence. The phone call came that evening, during the brief window when federal prisoners were allowed to make monitored calls. Maduro had been debating whether to call anyone, his children, his remaining allies, someone who might still care, when a corrections officer appeared at his cell. "Maduro, you've got an incoming call. Your wife, Celia." His wife of 32 years, currently detained at a women's facility in Connecticut, facing her own federal charges. They'd been allowed exactly 3 phone calls since their capture, each one monitored, each one limited to 15 minutes. Maduro followed the guard to the phone station, picked up the receiver with hands that had aged years in just 2 weeks. Cilia. Nico. Her voice sounded smaller than he remembered, diminished by distance and circumstance. Did you see? Delcy, yes. I saw. 3 hours with the CIA director, Nico. 3 hours. What could she possibly be telling them? Everything, Maduro thought, but didn't say. She's telling them everything. Our strategies, our weaknesses, our allies, our plans. She's giving them the keys to the kingdom because she's decided the kingdom isn't worth defending anymore. I don't know, he said instead. Maybe she's trying to protect Venezuela. Maybe she thinks cooperation is the only path forward. Or maybe she's saving herself. Cilia's voice carried an edge of bitterness that Maduro recognized from the mirror. The Americans probably offered her immunity, promised her she could keep power if she played along, and she took the deal. The possibility had occurred to Maduro, of course. The Trump administration would need someone to run Venezuela, someone with legitimacy within the existing government structure, someone willing to implement American policies while maintaining a Venezuelan face. Delcy Rodriguez fit that role perfectly. Former vice president, member of the Socialist Party, but pragmatic enough to pivot when circumstances demanded it. What do we do? Cilia asked. And the question hung in the air between them. What could they do? They were federal prisoners awaiting trial on charges that carried multiple life sentences. Their country was being reshaped without their input. Their former colleagues were cooperating with the government that had arrested them. We survive, Maduro said finally. We maintain our dignity. We don't give them the satisfaction of seeing us break. Too late, Cilia whispered. I'm already broken, Nico. Watching her stand at your podium, talking about new chapters and peaceful coexistence, it broke something in me. The call ended when the 15-minute timer expired. Maduro returned to his cell in silence, nodded to Rodriguez on the lower bunk, and climbed onto his own thin mattress. Sleep didn't come easily that night, or the nights that followed. The next bombshell dropped during a White House press briefing on Friday afternoon. Maduro had almost stopped watching the news, had almost convinced himself that ignorance might be easier than constant updates about his own irrelevance. But morbid curiosity won out, and he found himself watching as White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt fielded questions from reporters. Can you confirm reports that President Trump has invited acting Venezuelan President Rodriguez to visit Washington next month? Leavitt smiled with the practiced ease of someone delivering pre-planned messaging. President Trump has extended an invitation to acting President Rodriguez to visit the White House for discussions about the future of U.S.-Venezuelan relations. We believe acting President Rodriguez has demonstrated a genuine commitment to democratic reforms and economic cooperation. The president looks forward to a productive meeting. A White House visit. Delcy Rodriguez, the woman who'd served as Maduro's vice president, who'd defended his policies, who'd stood beside him through international condemnation, was going to visit the White House. She would walk through those corridors, shake hands with American officials, pose for photos with Donald Trump, and Maduro would watch it from a prison cell, powerless to intervene. The week that followed brought a cascade of developments that systematically demolished whatever remained of Maduro's influence or relevance. Rodriguez announced the release of another 200 political prisoners, bringing the total to over 600. She gave an interview to CNN, where she carefully distanced herself from Maduro's mistakes, while praising Hugo Chávez's original vision for Venezuela. She met with opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, the woman Maduro had spent years trying to silence, and discussed pathways to democratic transition. Each announcement, each policy shift, each symbolic gesture drove home the same message. Venezuela was moving forward, and Nicolás Maduro was part of the past. His lawyer visited on Tuesday with news that somehow made everything worse. Barry Pollock sat across the metal table in the attorney conference room, legal documents spread between them, and delivered an update that felt like a final nail in a coffin. Maduro was still occupying. The prosecution is preparing to introduce testimony from Delcy Rodriguez. The words didn't immediately register. Maduro stared at his lawyer, his dark brown eyes searching for some indication that he'd misheard. What? Acting President Rodriguez has agreed to provide testimony to federal prosecutors about your involvement in narcotics trafficking. She won't testify at trial. She's not cooperating to that extent. But she's given a deposition that prosecutors plan to use as evidence. Apparently, she has first-hand knowledge of meetings you held with cartel representatives, financial arrangements, protection schemes. Of course she had first-hand knowledge. She'd been in those meetings. She'd helped negotiate those arrangements. She'd been complicit in every decision Maduro had made regarding the cartels because that's what vice presidents do. They support their presidents. Now she was using that knowledge to help convict him. Can she do that? Maduro heard himself asking, can the acting president of Venezuela testify against the actual president? You're not the president anymore, Mr. Maduro. You're a federal defendant. And yes, she can testify. In fact, her testimony is particularly valuable to prosecutors because it establishes your personal involvement in specific criminal acts. This is very damaging to our case. Very damaging. The understatement of the century. The woman who'd been his closest political ally for 13 years was going to help send him to prison for life. Maduro returned to his cell in a daze. He lay on his bunk and tried to understand how everything had unraveled so completely. 2 weeks ago, he'd been the president of Venezuela, living in a palace, controlling a government, commanding an army. Now he was prisoner number 47283 Nidar 05. 4, wearing someone else's clothes, eating institutional food, and watching his former vice president systematically erase his legacy while building a new relationship with the country that had destroyed him. The television continued its coverage. A panel of Latin American policy experts discussed Rodriguez's pragmatic pivot and debated whether she represented genuine change or simply a more palatable face for continued authoritarianism. Nobody mentioned Maduro except as a problem that had been solved, an obstacle that had been removed, a chapter that had ended. On Wednesday, Rodriguez gave a televised address to the Venezuelan National Assembly. Maduro forced himself to watch, forced himself to witness what had become of the government he'd led. Delcy stood at the podium with confidence, flanked by ministers who'd once taken orders from Maduro and now took orders from her. "We stand at a crossroads," she began, her voice carrying throughout the chamber. "We can continue down the path of isolation, economic collapse, and international condemnation, or we can choose a new direction, one that prioritizes the welfare of our people over the preservation of failed policies." Failed policies. She was calling Maduro's entire presidency a failure, and the assembled legislators, many of whom Maduro had appointed, were nodding in agreement. "I have spoken with President Trump," Rodriguez continued. "I have met with CIA Director Ratcliffe. I have engaged in productive dialogue with international financial institutions. And I can report to this body that there is genuine willingness from the international community to support Venezuela's recovery, provided we demonstrate commitment to democratic reforms and economic cooperation." The legislators applauded. The cameras captured their enthusiasm. Rodriguez smiled with satisfaction. And Maduro, watching from 2,000 miles away in a Brooklyn prison cell, understood with terrible clarity that he was witnessing the complete dismantling of everything he'd tried to build. His cellmate Rodriguez spoke from the lower bunk, breaking Maduro's concentration. "You need to let it go, man. Whatever you're holding on to, whatever you thought you had, it's gone. Delcy's doing what she needs to do to survive. The government's doing what it needs to do to survive. Venezuela's moving on. You need to move on too. But how do you move on from betrayal by someone you trusted completely? How do you accept that 13 years of partnership meant so little that it could be abandoned in 13 days? How do you reconcile yourself to irrelevance when you've spent your entire adult life believing you mattered? Maduro didn't have answers to those questions. He only had the growing, inescapable realization that the revolution he'd tried to preserve was over, that the American empire he'd tried to resist had won, and that his former vice president had become the instrument of his ultimate defeat. The final twist came during a Sunday evening news broadcast. Maduro had spent the day trying not to watch television, trying to preserve some fragment of mental peace. But evening came, and habit drew him back to the screen, and CNN delivered news that felt like a betrayal beyond all the previous betrayals. In a surprising development, acting Venezuelan President Delcy Rodriguez announced today that she plans to run for president in elections scheduled for later this year. Rodriguez, who has governed Venezuela since the removal of Nicolás Maduro 2 weeks ago, said she believes she can unite the country and lead Venezuela toward economic recovery and democratic renewal. Running for president. Not as a caretaker, not as an interim figure, as a candidate seeking the office in her own right, seeking to legitimize through democratic processes the power she'd inherited through American military intervention. And according to early polling shown on the broadcast, she was leading Venezuelan citizens. Exhausted by years of economic collapse and political instability, were willing to give her a chance. They saw her as a fresh start, a break from the Maduro era, a path toward normalcy. She was going to win. She was going to become president of Venezuela, legitimately elected, internationally recognized, and she would owe it all to Donald Trump's decision to remove Maduro by force. The irony was devastating. Maduro had spent 13 years fighting to preserve power, to maintain the Bolivarian revolution, to resist American interference. And in the end, his own vice president had used American interference to seize power for herself, and the Venezuelan people were grateful for it. Sometimes the truth really is stronger than ideology, stronger than loyalty, stronger than shared history. The truth in this case was simple and brutal. Delcy Rodriguez had recognized which way the wind was blowing and adjusted her sails accordingly. She'd chosen survival over solidarity, pragmatism over principle, power over loyalty. And Maduro, sitting in his Brooklyn prison cell with nothing but memories and regrets, had to face the hardest truth of all. If their positions had been reversed, he probably would have done the same thing. That night, Maduro dreamed of the day he'd appointed Delcy Rodriguez as vice president. It had been 2017 during a ceremony at Miraflores Palace. He'd praised her loyalty, her intelligence, her commitment to the revolution. She'd stood beside him and pledged to serve Venezuela faithfully, to uphold the principles of Bolivarianism, to stand against imperialism in all its forms. 7 years later, she was negotiating with the CIA, releasing political prisoners, and preparing to run for president with American blessing. 7 years later, every pledge she'd made had been broken, every promise abandoned, every commitment forgotten. When Maduro woke, his pillow was damp with tears he didn't remember shedding. The small television still glowed in the pre-dawn darkness, showing news coverage of Rodriguez meeting with foreign diplomats, smiling for cameras, playing the role of democratic reformer. And Maduro understood, with a kind of clarity that only comes from complete defeat, that this was his legacy. Not the social programs he'd funded, not the anti-American speeches he'd given, not the revolution he'd tried to preserve. His legacy was the woman who'd betrayed him, who'd seized his power, who'd used his downfall as a stepping stone to her own ascension. Sometimes the strongest weapon isn't military force or economic pressure. Sometimes it's just the willingness to abandon loyalty when circumstance demands it. Delcy Rodriguez had wielded that weapon with devastating effectiveness, and Nicolás Maduro would spend the rest of his life, however many years that meant, in federal prison, living with the consequences. The revolution hadn't been defeated by American intervention. It had been abandoned by the people who'd claimed to believe in it most deeply. And that betrayal, Maduro realized, hurt far more than any military operation ever could.